going on, everybody? This is dkdynamite, and I'm sure you guys are still wondering why Dr. Monty was absent from Tag der Toten, despite there being this massive build-up to finally seeing his return, probably facing him in his squid form, and even seeing the return of the Shadow Man along with that, who's been locked inside the summoning key since Shadows of Evil. And since Revelations didn't happen, the Shadow Man never escaped the summoning key, so we're expecting a couple of different things, opening the key, releasing the Shadow Man, having him face off against Monty while we do something else. We were expecting to go up against Monty, maybe destroy him, and then destroy the key with that. We were expecting a lot of different things, but none of that ended up happening. There's actually two reasons why Dr. Monty didn't return. The first reason has to do with logistical, real-life issues with development behind the scenes, while the second actual reason has to do with the storyline, and Treyarch really came up with a plan B in the case that they couldn't get Malcolm McDowell to do the voice of Monty again within Black Ops 4. So let's first jump into the storyline reasoning. So many of you out there were all expecting many different things, as was I, with Tag der Toten. Ultimates will prevail. We're expecting Samantha to destroy a giant apothecant, as we saw in the Alpha Omega intro. We're expecting Ultimus Richtofen to join our other three Primus characters and go to the house. We were expecting a lot of different things. But then we came to realize in the Tag der Toten ending that, as Nikolai said, we have gone to the Great War many times and tried facing Monty head on, but we were doomed to fail. We just could never win. Even with the Shadow Man on our side, even facing both of them or going in this three-way fight, we would never win. So what I'm going to assume here, and you guys probably assume this too, is that the Chronorium also showed Nikolai the alternate outcomes when we do go to the Great War. So that's what we see in the Alpha Omega intro, with Samantha destroying an apothecant, us at the Great War, marching with them, using the staves again probably. All of that does happen in some other version of the Broken Cycle, where we do break the cycle successfully, but instead of going to Tag der Toten and doing those events, we just go to the Great War head on. So that is probably an outcome to what could have happened if we chose to do that. But the actual real scenario where we do succeed and finally close off all of this nonsense is when Nikolai and the two crews sacrifice themselves. And it's crazy to think that, wait, there was a bunch of build up to the Great War throughout the entire season of Black Ops 4, but we just never saw it, not even in the background, not much in the cutscene. So what happened with that? Well, when it comes to the storyline, Treyarch really pulled a really interesting plot twist, and this is what it was. So since Dr. Monty could see the souls of just about everybody except for Primus Nikolai and the Victus crew, this is where Nikolai had the upper hand. If Nikolai were to fool everybody into thinking they were going to the Great War, Monty would be able to see their souls and be like, okay, they're really anticipating the Great War, they're getting ready for it, I'm gonna go wait there for them. Since he was under the interpretation that Primus and Ultimus were going to the Great War, as Primus Nikolai told him they were going, that's why Monty wasn't in Tag der Toten. He also can't see the Victus crew since Victus still have their souls. So Monty had no idea what was going on with Victus at Tag der Toten with Pablo. He had no idea about any of that. So that's why he didn't intervene within Tag der Toten or the Call of the Dead remake. But when it comes to Primus Nikolai, since he couldn't see Primus Nikolai, he couldn't have saw him reading the Chronorium and knowing what his true destiny was. So Nikolai's destiny was to fool the two crews into thinking they were going to the Great War, knowing that Monty can see them. Once he knew Monty could see them, Nikolai had to come up with a plan B and say, you know what, I'm going to tell them one thing so that Monty can sense that and see it, while I really have another plan up my sleeve that Monty would never expect. Now, as I said, in other versions of the Broken Cycle, they did go to the Great War and they were doomed to fail, as Nikolai said in the ending cutscene for Tag der Toten. So the Alpha Omega ending still makes sense. Samantha was pissed that she just saw Maxis die, so she even said herself, we're going to go to the Great War, we're going to the house, we're going to kill Monty. That is exactly true, because in other versions of the Broken Cycle, as I said, they did go through with that. But this time, in this version of the Broken Cycle, Nikolai really took a different turn, and it was for the better. It was to ensure that they don't go to the Great War and fail, so the cycle doesn't repeat, because yes, even the Broken Cycle could repeat itself, which is kind of confusing to most people, but essentially the Aether is full of a bunch of different cycles. We have a cycle, at Shangri-La with Brock and Gary, we have a cycle with Mob of the Dead, we have a cycle with Primus and Black Ops 3, then we have the Broken Cycle, which is almost a cycle in and of itself, which again could be confusing, but in this version, Nikolai says, you know what, instead of going to the Great War, we're going to go ahead and kill ourselves in the forest, essentially, which then banishes everything to the Dark Aether. So if you guys are confused about how the Broken Cycle is a cycle in and of itself and not just breaking the old cycle, we learn in Tag der Toten that when we send Pablo Marinus to the Great War at the very end of the Easter egg, he he goes back and meets up with Primus, who he does meet anyway in the original Great War, but this time he has that Richtofen go back, freeze himself in Alcatraz, and wake up with the Fire Staff Crystal that then allows him to go through the events of the Blood of the Dead ending and banish everything in Purgatory using the crystal, and then telling Primus Nikolai that it's his destiny to defeat Dr. Monty and learn of his true calling. So obviously in the original cycle, Monty sends Primus back to the Great War, they then die off in the war or eventually just pass away from natural causes, and they're reborn for the cycle to continue from Origins onward. But I guess this time, because of Tagger Toten being a paradox as well, Pablo goes back to the Great War thanks to our help in the Easter egg, and he warns Primus Richtofen, or I should say Revelations Richtofen with the robe, that he actually has to break the cycle and it's time to close the loop and end everything as we know it. So he then frees himself under Alcatraz, and everything from Black Ops 4 then happens. But because Richtofen doesn't have his soul, it's up to Nikolai to enact a final plan that Monty can't see. So that's why he has to fool the two crews into thinking they're going to the war, because that's where Monty is going to be waiting for them at. And yes, in other versions of the Broken Cycle, that actually happens. They do go to the Great War. And the reason I stress that is because we obviously have a lot of music videos for various zombie maps in Black Ops 3 and 4. And if you guys are wondering what those even mean, if you still don't know, those are actually alternate versions or alternate outcomes with different cycles. So there are versions where we actually fail going through the cycle of BO3 or BO4, and that's very clear since our characters end up dying in some of those music videos. But it's funny how Treyarch themselves made it canon when you die. If you die in a game of zombies without doing the Easter egg, that's still technically canon and is a version of whatever that cycle is being failed. So Treyarch have really wrote themselves in an interesting place with zombies, making everything you do canon to the story. Whether you do the Easter egg, whether you die, whether you make it to a high round, everything you do is canon in some way, shape, or form, which to me is quite interesting when it comes to the Aether storyline. But this also leads me to the logistical reasoning for why Dr. Monty couldn't return in Black Ops 4. Sure, the story explanation I gave you guys works perfectly and ties up a lot of loose ends. However, there are real life issues that also explain it. As you all may know, at around the time of Operation Grand Heist, Treyarch's budget was cut, and the reason why is not just because they wasted millions on a scrap campaign and Activision was pissed, but Raven and Sledgehammer couldn't put their differences aside with Call of Duty 2020, since Raven was put in charge of that entire project, with Sledgehammer being their support and not the other way around like we were used to with World War II and Advanced Warfare and the games before that. So Treyarch had to step in and take over the entire project because Activision, who's their boss, told them to do that, which obviously puts the post-launch content for Black Ops 4 in shambles. So with that being said, how many people were left working on Black Ops 4? And we can clearly see that with the quality and post-launch content we got with every operation after Operation Grand Heist. That's very clear. So with that being said, their budget being cut might have been the reason why they couldn't afford Malcolm McDowell to return to the studio to play Dr. Monty again, or it could have even been issues with Malcolm McDowell himself having scheduling conflicts or not wanting to return to the role at all. So again, there's storyline explanation and there's real life explanations for why Malcolm McDowell didn't return to the studio. But looking at the story they set in stone with Blood of the Dead and Classified when it comes to Aether, I do believe in my heart that Treyarch really anticipated the return of Malcolm McDowell's Dr. Monty at some point later in the Aether DLC season. But that also, revolves around the original idea that Chaos was supposed to be the entire first year of DLC for Black Ops 4. The Black Ops Pass would have covered an entire year of just Chaos maps, and that was leaked quite a while ago, which would have left Aether to return, during year 2 of a planned second season of content for Black Ops 4. And that was the original plan that we knew about, which was confirmed by Treyarch at the reveal event. That Black Ops 4 was meant to be a multi-year game, even going through the life cycles of Modern Warfare and Call of Duty 2020, because I believe Activision wanted to make it clear that Infinity Ward and Sledgehammer wouldn't be doing zombies anymore because it just doesn't sell as much as Treyarch, so they'd rather put those resources somewhere else. So they'd rather have Treyarch continuously update zombies in Black Ops 4 even through the next few Call of Duties until Treyarch's full next game. So that was the original plan, which would have left Aether to return in a year 2, and maybe they were somehow planning to save their budget perfectly for year 2 to bring back Malcolm McDowell, but because their budget got cut, because they had to actually end Chaos a little bit early and return to Aether with DLC 3, maybe that's where the budget cuts really affected their ability to bring back Malcolm McDowell for Dr. Monty. So even though the storyline explanation I gave for why Monty didn't return makes sense, there still is one thread that's technically still left open to interpretation, and and that's in regards to Ultimus prevailing. As we have with the writing on the wall in Classified, Ultimus really didn't prevail in Tag Their Toten, but I do believe that was part of a thread or some explanation they would have actually fleshed out in a year 2 if Aether had gotten a year 2 and wasn't actually fleshed out with just DLC 3 and 4. I believe Ultimus prevailing was part of some scrap story thread that they just couldn't execute with Black Ops 4. However, Nikolai still needing his soul to defeat Dr. Monty is very relevant. As I said earlier, when Revelations Richtofen told Primus Nikolai he had to keep his soul in order to defeat Dr. Monty, that still makes sense with the context of Tag Their Toten, because Nikolai couldn't have went through with this plan to essentially kill the crews in their sleep if he didn't have his soul. Monty would have saw that coming and probably would have killed him before he could even do that and would have restarted the cycle all over again. So because he still had his soul, he was able to trick the other crews into thinking they were going to the Great War, so Monty could sense that and wait for them there, while secretly Nikolai was just gonna, have everybody die in the frozen forest, which is insane. Another thing about the frozen forest, as I said, many weeks ago, the frozen forest would come to the forefront and be explained, since it's been a mystery all the way since the beginning of Black Ops 3. And I'll give you an example here. Primus Takeo, in his memory trailer, literally talks about how he wants to be under a cherry blossom tree and be in peace. Then in the Tag Their Toten ending, that's exactly what he says again, that, where he wants to see himself in the future is under a cherry blossom tree and dying in peace, while, Ultimus Takeo wants to die knowing he pleased the Emperor and pleased his ancestors. So all of that is still very relevant, but when those trailers first came out for Black Ops 3, they weren't exactly relevant to the context of Black Ops 3's story, but instead were relevant to the story that would be told in the next Black Ops game, or the ending to the Aether story. So I love how Treyarch tied back to those memory trailers, because everybody was still wondering about what they meant, and my theory was correct. Yes, those were actually referencing the ending to the Aether. Now, they were obviously reminiscing on their journey and what they had been through, where they want to be, and they weren't just doing that because Nikolai asked them and because he was like, we're close to victory, so let's celebrate. It wasn't just because of that. It was also because of the Agarthian device, which was described as something close to a genie lamp within the Aether story. You can actually make a wish and be granted that if you do the right steps. Victus did the right steps with that Agarthian device in Tag Their Toten, which allowed Primus Nikolai to then have the other two crews make their wishes on where they want to be, so that once everything was banished to the Dark Aether, they can then live their life out in peace where they wanted to be. So they all made their wishes in the actual ending to the map, and once Samantha and Eddie step into the light and everything else is banished to the Dark Aether, that's where our crews ended up. So the story of Tag Their Toten really plays on a lot of plot twists. Nikolai fooling the crews into not only thinking they were going to the Great War so that Monty could sense that, but also fooling them into making wishes, because thanks to Victus, the Agarthian device would allow them to actually grant their wishes and go to those places they wanted to go after everything else was banished to the Dark Aether. It's probably the most satisfying ending they could have wrote for our characters, and that doesn't include Victus. I'll be talking about Victus in a separate video, because that's another can of worms that leads into some DLC 5 stuff I really want to jump into. But when it comes to just Tag Their Toten and Primus and Ultimus, it was the most creative ending they could have actually wrote, but also went against everybody's expectations and also covered things that many of us probably forgot about, like Harveyina, the Ascension Group, the Blacksmith from Buried, Pablo Marinus himself and his reveal. So many great things that hardcore Aether fans absolutely adored in the map. But as I've said before, and I'll say this once again here in the video to close this off, I think the ending cutscene itself, despite not being rendered in CGI and being animated, I think the ending itself was as close as you can get to flawless. I just think the build-up with the Easter egg is the only issue with it. I love the steps of the Easter egg. I think they're all very replayable. I just think the lack of a boss fight, even though no other Victus map has had a boss fight before, I just think the lack of that boss fight before a big cutscene like that is the only thing that let me down. I think adding any type of boss fight, let it be a crazy boss fight against Marguaz, or even the Shadow Man himself, or maybe even Monty, just with him in his squid form talking to Apothicon without Malcolm McDowell, that would have been something that added a lot of weight to the ending cutscene. I think a lot of people out there agree with that too. It was more of a gameplay thing that kind of took away from the ending, less than the actual cutscene itself. It wasn't about the cutscene or that it was animated or that they died in their sleep or any of that. It was more of the gameplay leading up to it, and a very questionable final step with the blackout collapse essentially being reskinned and closing in on you as you kind of roam your way back to the facility. It's a bit of a weird step, but the steps before that were really interesting. Some really cool lore with the Keepers and Apothicons, a lot of explanations to things that we've been wondering for so many years, and I loved everything about it. So again, this is a bit of an explanation as to where Monty was and a bit of an explanation of the ending, but there's still more to talk about. As I've said earlier, there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to Victus. I'll be doing that in a separate video because that opens up a different can of worms when it comes to DLC 5 and some other stuff like that. But when it comes to Monty, Primus, and Ultimus, they really had a plan B in many aspects. Again, if their budget was cut and they couldn't get Malcolm McDowell back, they were able to write the story in a unique way to say, you know what, we can't get Monty back in the map or in a cutscene or anything else, but we could say that Monty was right the entire time, that their journey is the reason why all of this existed. So you would either have two outcomes. You have the Black Ops 3 outcome, where you have a non-stop cycle where Monty's kind of in control of everything, or you have us breaking the cycle and having outcomes with that too. You can break the cycle, go to the Great War and die, repeat it again, or you can break the cycle, kill yourself, and banish everything to the Dark Aether. But regardless, Primus and Ultimus were pretty much screwed. Ultimus would either die after getting experimented on after the events of Moon, or they would get saved by Primus, as we saw in Classified, and go on with the Black Ops 4 story and still die anyway. And when it comes to Primus, they either get thrown into a cycle, for eternity, or they could break it and eventually have to kill themselves or die at the Great War and some other outcomes. It's a lot to take in, but again, I'm a big fan of how everything ended, and there will be plenty more storyline videos to cover when it comes to Black Ops 4 and the Aether story in general, possibly leading into a Dark Aether reboot and some other crazy things we'll be going over in the actual near future. But that is about it. This has been dkdynamite. Check out links down below in the description. What do you guys think about the ending to Tag their Toten, as well as why Dr. Monty wasn't present in the map? Thank you so much for watching. That is about it. Really hope you've enjoyed, and peace out, everyone.